let's go to questions for Brad.
Hello?
Yes.
This is Dave Robinson at URI.
Hi, Dave.
And I have a question for Brad, or a couple of questions. Brad, you had mentioned the European heritage preservation practitioners that have been involved in looking at maritime cultural landscapes and publishing on it in 1992. Have you engaged any of them to see where things stand today with the development, the further development and evolution of the maritime cultural landscape concept and how it gets applied in maritime heritage preservation contexts over there?
Yeah, we haven't. We've just begun to do that, and interesting you should mention that because Jim Delgado was at a meeting over in someplace in Europe and ran into Christer Westerdahl. And they had a long conversation, and Jim sort of laid out the kind of things we were doing with maritime cultural landscapes, and Jim said that Christer was delighted with where we were headed. Mm. So that kind of validation is sort of rare, but I think it's important for us to do that because there is a lot going on, and we certainly are reaching out and more broadly to try to understand what's happening in places like Europe where they've been working on some of these ideas longer than we have.
Right, right. My second question for you is, and maybe you touched on this in your presentation and it just skipped my mind, but how do you, or do you define any kind of boundaries for a maritime cultural landscape? As you were speaking and about it conceptually, I immediately started to think about, I think it was Barbara's comments at the beginning of the conference call about terminology and the importance of terminology and discussing some of the different definitions of some of the terms that are used in this discussion. It occurred to me that what I was seeing described as a maritime cultural landscape in your talk is quite a bit different than the submerged paleocultural landscape that we're going to be talking about in a little bit, and the way that that's thought of. So I'm curious, are there any types of boundaries that you would consider with a maritime cultural landscape? To me, it seems like it extends to the surface of the water that's being used, as well as the interface between land and water. But in our case, we're dealing with a landscape that's been inundated, submerged, impacted. We've got sort of time transgressive maritime cultural landscape opportunities in the submerged landscape, paleocultural landscape, but it's a different, they're just different, and I think it's important for us to recognize that there is a difference.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that our focus is on looking at integrating the maritime cultural landscapes into our site, and so we have kind of constrained boundaries already. Is that we have a site, and so and the Redwood Coast is a good example of that because we looked at all of the significant kind of historical activities and the cultural activities that occurred within there, and then we looked at kind of the boundaries of the kind of effect of those activities and areas, and one of the things we discovered was that the reach of the actual boundary, if you will, and I'm not sure they're distinct boundaries, but the sort of fuzzy boundary of the cultural landscape for that particular expansion area was actually further north than the areas that we've been looking at previously. So it's a little easier for us because we have discrete sites that are established by meet and bound, and so we're looking at those activities within that particular site.
Okay, thank you.
But if you're starting from first principles, it's going to be very difficult to determine what the boundary of the landscape actually is.
Mm.
This is John Jensen. I'd like to respond to Dave's question a little bit, if I could, because I think it's a very important one. And one of the elements that we've struggled with, Rod Mather and I and others in the Cultural Heritage Working Group, and is recognizing that when we go for a cultural landscape approach or think about cultural landscapes, we're really dealing with two different things, at least. One, it's landscapes in the property sense of the word. How does that connect up with the National Register and a kind of property that's worth understanding, assessing, and choosing to preserve? That's the functional element of it. And then there is the bigger picture, which is using a cultural landscape approach as a way of looking at the world, as a way of looking at maritime space. And so I think, there's room, and both things are, they can work with one another very well, but there are two different ways that it works.
Thanks, John. Thanks, John.
John Mark is from Guam. We're trying to currently, or at least the Lieutenant Governor, is trying to together a maritime cultural landscape. And the fact that the seal of Guam has a river that brings to the ocean palm tree and a pearl, which is their natural or the cultural used here or during short time, and the seal was made sometime I think around 1913, and so now they're looking to get a grant. Basically, since World War II, the military has changed the river to the ocean, and I think they moved it about a half a mile or a mile. And they want to do now is create a living seal. So the picture that the gentleman drew for the seal has the river and the palm tree and a point, two lovers point, which you can see across the island here on Guam. And so we're trying to recreate that now with the new river that the military put in after World War II. So it would be one of those things, if we can get that going, it shows the symbolic aspect of the cultural, of the seal and the vision that was had, at the turn of the century there, about 100 years ago.
Yeah, that sounds terrific.
Do we have time for another question?
Oh,
Sure,
go ahead. Ask a question.
Okay, this is Larry Fry in Hawaii. Thanks, Brad, for a great presentation. I certainly agree with the cultural landscape approach. So a comment and a question. My comment first is that if anybody is interested, there is a lengthy dissertation being published this year on how to look at landscape form in traditional fishing villages along the west coast of Florida. It uses Cortez, Florida as a model. But it's a really lengthy dissertation, and it really discusses a lot of the things that Brad was talking about today. And so if everybody wants to keep an eye out for that, I think it'd be a worthy read during your spare time. One of my questions is for Brad. Have you looked at, with any focus at traditional fishing villages, mostly vernacular fishing villages in the U.S.? Has that been a part of your study?
Yeah, it's certainly within the scope of what we're hoping to be able to include within maritime cultural landscapes. I know that in the Redwood Coast document and some other work that's been done, we have looked at those traditional fishing villages and the landscape, the sort of commercial fishing and fishing landscapes of these areas. Yeah. So it is something that we're looking at. It's again, it's an evolving kind of a part of the approach.
Okay, because I think one thing that leads to the cultural landscape approach in this context is the fact that a lot of the infrastructure, the historic infrastructure of historic fishing villages is no longer there. So you read National Register nominations about these fishing villages, and they really concentrate on the dwellings that are there. And all of the most important things, the elements that make them historic, are now missing, and they're rarely discussed in some of the National Register nominations. For example, the net drying docks that used to be used when cotton nets were around, because vernacular dwellings can be found anywhere, not just maritime cultural landscapes. So that's one thing I think that's important, and I certainly think traditional fishing villages are an important focus.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the other elements of that that's particularly interesting is looking at the changes in fishing grounds over time.
Yes.
Because it really does provide that link between the changes in the environment and the changes in the human use. And there's been quite a bit of work being done in New England about that, and I think it's all really fascinating and certainly very relevant to the work that we're doing with maritime cultural landscapes.
Yes, and Michael Chiarapa out of Canada is doing some great work in the Great Lakes for anybody that's interested in that. Thanks for taking my question.
Well, yeah, great.
Larry, who are you with? Hippo or?
I'm with Hawaii Volcanoes National Park.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, great. Well, I think we got